welcome to 24 Hours for Climate. My name is Catherine Fior. I'm a journalist with EU Reporter, and I'm also a member of the Brussels Press Club. I'm delighted to welcome Sabine Frank, who is Executive Director of Carbon Market Watch. Sabine, Carbon Market Watch, what do you do? What is your role?
Well, as the name suggests, we watch carbon markets, and there are various carbon markets in the world. In the EU context, the most important one is that of the European emissions trading system, which tries to put a price on the emissions of power plants and heavy industry and airlines as well, and soon maybe more sectors. But internationally, there's been a carbon market around for a very long time, established by the Kyoto Protocol. The clean development mechanism was developed under that. I know it sounds arcane, but it basically established a big international carbon market. And Carbon Market Watch has been watching these markets, looking for the pitfalls, looking for whether they actually deliver emission reductions and help save our climate for a very long time, for over a decade now.
And climate neutral, what exactly does that mean for you? I mean, we hear it bandied around, Europe is going to be climate neutral by 2050. And to be concrete about it, what does that mean for you as an organisation, for Europe and indeed the world?
Indeed, there are many terms flying around, and it's important to look at them very closely to understand what they mean. Climate neutrality, not just for us, for everybody, it means the goal that humans return to the point where they have no more net impact on the climate system. And the word that's really important here is the word net, because it doesn't mean the point where we don't emit greenhouse gases anymore, but it means where we possibly emit less, but outbalance the emissions also by removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And from our point of view, it's really very important to keep those two separate. The emission reductions and the carbon removals have separate targets for them and account for them separately.
Shouldn't they be equaling each other out, or isn't that the ultimate goal? I mean, is there a danger here that if you have offsetting, that there in some ways you think, well, I've offset my emissions, therefore I can take that long haul flight to New Zealand every week?
Well, let's be absolutely clear about it. The most important thing is that we reduce emissions. All our efforts have to go into reducing emissions. We know it's acknowledged by the International Panel on Climate Change that we won't get away without removals, without the natural solutions and the technological solutions to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But the focus has to be on the emission reductions, on changing the way we produce and we consume and we live, so that we emit less, and the carbon removals come separate. And the offsets are a bit of a different story, because as the name suggests, it means we emit somewhere and we save emissions somewhere else. I mean, typically it means that emissions that are generated, say, by an industrial plant in Europe are compensated typically by a project somewhere in the developing world. But it's a zero-sum game. It doesn't actually lead to the reduction of emissions. And what's more important, often it isn't actually quite a zero-sum game, because the projects which are supposed to produce the offsets don't deliver the emission reductions necessary, or there are problems with how they are accounted for.
And we see some very large companies in the petrochemical, fossil fuels industry rebranding themselves, have a nice flower logo, a nice green logo. They claim to be climate neutral. I mean, and to be offsetting some of their emissions by forestry. Are you looking at these big companies specifically, or is it more the overall country goals?
Well, our main focus is on climate policy. That is how policy makers regulate carbon markets and how they regulate the offsetting markets, the voluntary market for offsetting. But of course, we look at the announcements of of companies as well. There are about 800 companies in the world by now that have made some sort of climate pledge, either a carbon neutrality, a pledge, a net zero pledge, a climate neutrality pledge, and these have to be looked at very carefully. What we are looking for is whether a company actually has a comprehensive decarbonization strategy. That is, whether it looks at all aspects of its operations, the operations themselves, a bit further away, say the emissions that are related to the energy it consumes, or the emissions produced up and down its value chain. But what we see often is that the efforts of companies are piecemeal, that they say they offer particular climate neutral products. Say Shell offered us climate neutral driving by offering a form of petrol which has offsets built into it. Or the latest example, Total announcing that it is able to sell climate neutral liquefied natural gas, that is fossil gas, by virtue of offsetting for the carbon emissions associated with that. And well, I could go into the details if you're interested in them. They are very these are very problematical examples.
As individuals, people. We spoke to activists. They want to make a difference. They want to make the right choices. As consumers, how can we know that these labels are reliable? Is there anybody governing these labels? Obviously, you're keeping an eye on them, but we want to make choices that are the right choices for the environment. How do we do it if we can't trust these labels?
Well, indeed, we're all challenged to look at what we're being told very, very carefully, and not to believe any claim to carbon neutrality lightly. Of course, it would be nice to be let off the need for real hard change in the way how we consume and we live, but essentially it still boils down to that we have to look at the way we consume and reduce our emissions, and usually that means less flying, it means less driving with petrol cars, it means looking carefully at what we buy and how it is consumed. Offsetting for the consumer is a last resort. When you really have to fly, yes, by all means then offset, or better still, just do climate finance rather than offsetting. It's a
And when the European Commission is promoting its carbon neutrality by 2050, do you think that there is enough emphasis on the needed behavioural change, that those choices that we are going to have to make about not using a car or using it much less or not taking those flights? Do you think that there is enough emphasis on this in the thinking of not just the European Commission but governments across Europe and beyond?
Yes, I do think so. Policymakers, however, are first of all looking at the big players in pollution. They're looking at how we produce our energy, our electricity. They're looking at industry. They're looking at road transport. They're looking at emissions associated with buildings and heating from buildings. It's a complex picture.
Voluntary offsetting through purchases of carbon credits do show a commitment to climate CO2 reductions, but it also makes sense, I suppose, to finance projects that increase carbon neutral sinks. I mean, what is your take on that?
Well, the classical projects there are afforestation or forest protection projects, and it's very easy to latch onto the idea that the solutions are in forests. And let me be clear about this: forests and looking after forests, protecting forests, promoting forests is a good thing. Forests are good for the climate. They're good for biodiversity. They're good for humans' body and soul. But where it becomes problematical is using forests as offsets to kind of account for our climate sins. Because there are too many problems associated with making the direct link of how many emissions we can, how much carbon we can store in forests, and how that can compensate for our emissions. In technical terms, these are problems of permanence, of baseline settings, of land use change. I can break this down a little. Say, if you pay for an afforestation project somewhere, who is to say that the equivalent amount of even more forest isn't deforested somewhere else? Also, carbon stays in the atmosphere for at least 100 years. So you'd also have to guarantee that the carbon, the equivalent carbon of offsetting, is stored in trees for 100 years. So that's 3 generations of people who'd have to look after that forest. Forests also don't just grow, they also decay. And in the worst case, they actually burn down. And we've all seen the news about forest fires in California, in Australia, in Kenya, and wherever. And in some cases, it's actually forests that have burned down that have been generating carbon credits. So what about those carbon credits now? Are they still valuable? Well, they're not. So you see, this is all very tricky.
It does sound very difficult. But are you more optimistic for mechanisms like carbon capture and storage? Would that be a more effective way to take carbon out of the environment?
Well, we won't get around it, is the short answer. We will have to rely on those technologies to a degree, but they must not be an excuse to continue emitting. The emphasis still has to be on reducing emissions and changing our ways of production so that we do not emit greenhouse gases anymore. And the challenge is also to regulate all these technologies, and again, how you account for the removals achieved. So there is still a big governance challenge. There is still a big challenge on policy makers to get the governance framework for carbon removal, both the natural solutions and the technologies, right.
The European Commission seems to look at market mechanisms to do this, emissions trading. I mean, how many countries across the world are now signed up to emissions trading? We see that China is taking it very seriously. United States at this moment less so. I mean, are market mechanisms a valuable part of this? And now we also see the European Commission looking at some sort of carbon border tax in addition to this. So these very market-based mechanisms, I agree with what you say. I mean, it's all about reduction, but to what extent can they play a role, and is there a danger we're too reliant on them?
Well, if you listen to environmental economists, they tell you carbon markets are the most efficient way of dealing with emissions. But in reality, of course, they're not completely efficient. Say, take the European emissions trading system, which has existed since 2005. It only fairly recently has begun to actually have an impact, say, on the power sector and facilitating the phase out of coals, the shift away from coal as a source, as the fossil fuel with which to generate electricity. But on other sectors, it has not had an impact yet, simply because the price isn't actually high enough that is being generated under these trading systems, for many reasons, for imperfections built into the system as the result of lobbying, industry pressure, arguments about competitivity, the effect on jobs, etc., etc. This system is being reviewed, and we have to shift the balance here, get some more voices in than the industry issues that foreground the competitivity issue so much. Get other voices in that will emphasize the need to save our climate more. We as Carbon Market Watch, we are clear carbon markets are only part of the solution. They are not the entire solution. There always have to be other policy measures to tackle emission reductions.
A big concern is some of the changes that are needed, and they are urgently needed. I think we all agree on this, but it's very difficult for communities where they're reliant on cars, whether they're rural communities or where their livelihood depends on, say, coal. What would you say to those people who feel like they are, in a sense, the victims of this climate agenda?
Well, you will have heard the term just transition. It's not just about getting rid of emissions and penalizing polluters or penalizing those people who are associated with polluting industries, but it's about resources and how we shift them and how we finance changes in production, in the livelihoods of regions and of people, so as to win their support as well for the change that is necessary.
So, what would your advice be to companies? How can they be clearer about what they're doing, what their footprint is, what activities they're undertaking to clean up their acts?
Well, there is already an established protocol that helps companies assess their carbon footprint or their impact on the climate, and that also allows them to develop an action plan to become compatible with the climate. It's so-called Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions they can look at. So those directly related to their production, those related to the energy they consume or the transport involved, and up and down the effects up and down the value chain. Well, we encourage companies to take as holistic an approach to this, to be as complete in their assessment and in their climate ambitions as possible, not to be selective, not just to offer a selection of green offerings that might give the customers the impression that, oh, this is a bona fide company, this is a green company, when actually it doesn't represent the whole picture.
From what you've seen of companies, where are the most hidden emissions, if you like? Where are they failing to recognise their impact on the environment? Are they blinded by? Do they have a blind spot about some of their activities? So, for example, I was hearing recently about using waste from farms to create biogas, and then, however, these facilities, to keep them going, use maize, and that maize is subsidised, and that in order to keep the company going. So in the end, the actual energy use and the actual economic justification doesn't really work out in the end. It's so what started off as a good idea, you might have a blind spot for consequences that you did not foresee.
Well, before we talk about blind spots, let's talk about blatant areas first. Take fossil fuel companies. The biggest problem is, of course, that a lot of investment still goes into the exploration and in the infrastructure needed for fossil fuels, and that is just, well, it's a business model of yesterday. Yes, we'll have to rely on fossil fuels for a bit longer, but we shouldn't be investing in them anymore. We shouldn't be investing in them playing a role in the future. They need to be phased out. And fossil fuel companies, they are investing in renewables, but they don't get the same kind of return on the renewables than they get from the fossil fuel investment. So this is still a very big problem. And in the meantime, fossil fuel companies are trying to make us believe, because they invest a bit in renewables and because they offset, that their basic business model is still okay and that it should be perpetuated.
A big target for the European Union, at least, is to look at our interim 2030 ambitions. What would you say to the leaders meeting in December at the European Council to discuss the targets for 2030? What do we have to do, and how ambitious do they have to be?
Well, I'd say accept at least the ambition of the European Parliament. The European Parliament has put forward 60% emission reductions compared to the 55 of the European Commission. And well, what I'd also like to say to them again is keep emission reductions separate from carbon removals, because that was the big shocking surprise that in contrast to the goal, the 2030 emission reduction goal that we currently have in place, the new goal actually calculates in the carbon removal. So it's not actually a goal of minus 55%, it is a goal of 52, maybe only just 50. Our big appeal is we need separate targets for emission reductions and carbon removals.
This is a global conversation that we're having and involving press clubs across the world. We've been looking very much at the European dimension, but how does it fit in globally? Obviously, we can't do this by ourselves. We've got one planet, we're sharing it together. How do we work together on this in an effective way?
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, of course, in Europe, we are focused on the European Green Deal, and that is quite, despite all the shortcomings that we're in the business of pointing out, it is quite a forward-looking and good initiative, especially if you look at a global scenario where we have many countries that are still led by climate change deniers and that really impede progress of the international community. And the pandemic hasn't helped. We've had, first of all, we had no success on some still very crucial aspects of the Paris Agreement at the last COP, Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC. And now the next COP, which was supposed to take place this year, has been postponed. The EU, in the meantime, is trying to be a bit of a climate leader, trying to inspire others to be similarly ambitious with their policy. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, or carbon border tax as it's also referred to, is one of the climate diplomacy tools that the European Union is trying to employ. It's tricky. It might have an impact. We have to see.
In terms of international diplomacy, another area where the European Union has tremendous power is in the area of trade. And an area of controversy has been the Mercosur Agreement and what's happening under Bolsonaro in Brazil. I mean, should the European Union be using the full might of its power as a trading superpower to impose conditions on these countries?
Oh, absolutely, and that has been the weakness of the trading agreements that the European Union has tried to put into place. That it actually has not insisted enough on environmental safeguards. That it was, all left too vague. And the fact that the Mercosur Agreement is now so endangered is a very good thing, because the climate provisions have not been strong enough in this particular agreement.
Overall, when we look at the world around us, we see a lot of activism, we see a lot of statements. But do you think there is the will to turn this situation around? Do you think COP26, I think it's 26 is the next one, will be able to make the difference that is needed, and for us all to take this much more seriously at every single level?
Yeah, probably we have to. I mean, the UNFCCC operates by unanimity, right? So that's a very high bar. But if a significant subset of countries makes progress, that's also good. And if we got a different US administration in November, that would certainly also help the international climate negotiations. Over the last thorny issue of the Article 6, the design of the international carbon markets.
And what is that particular? Well, that's your area where you're.
Well, that's the thing that regulates the trading of emission reductions internationally and how they are accounted for. So that is very important. When we talked about offsets earlier, there we're looking at the so-called voluntary market, the market for carbon credits that are bought not out of legal obligation, but out of voluntary action. And that market is really flourishing at the moment. I mean, on the one hand, you could say it's a good thing that there are so many voluntary actors, so many companies that want to buy carbon credits internationally. And this market has doubled in the last year. I mean, imagine that it has doubled in volume, and it is due to increase further, but it is not regulated enough. And you also have to ask, where should all those carbon credits actually come from? Because under the Paris Agreement, every country, no longer just the industrialized countries, but every country in the world is meant to do their utmost to reduce emissions, to come up with really ambitious so-called nationally determined contributions. So there shouldn't be any carbon credits left to sell as offsets, right? But the voluntary market at the moment is developing as if those carbon credits were a never-ending supply.
Well, on that note, Sabine Frank, Executive Director, Carbon Market Watch, thank you very much indeed.